Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick, back again to chat about X-Wing. Now, before we start, I just want to say a massive thank you to you guys, because yesterday the channel ticked over 1,000 subs, and that to me is crazy. The fact that there's 1,000 of you out there that want to listen to my ramblings about a game about plastic spaceships, let alone do it on a regular basis, is pretty big, and I really appreciate that. I'll do a big thank you video with Justin when I get a chance to record that with him, but for the time being, thank you so much for that, guys. The reason I'm making this video today is because we had a chat during last week about the FAQ and the changes that brings to our list building, to the style of gameplay and all that kind of stuff. And it really got me thinking, based on the kind of responses I got from that video, the chats I had with you guys, etc., about what the key elements of game design that we look for as players, or just as commentators of the game in general. And I want to talk about that here. What are the key things that we as players look for? And in terms of what the errata does to the game, how does that affect these key elements? Obviously, the errata primarily is designed to address how the game is balanced, and that's the first thing I want to look at. Balance. Balance exists so that game elements can interact in a way that is fair and offer as many different options as possible in terms of gameplay and squad design. Balance is important not only between individual components, such as ships and upgrades, but also between large groups of components, such as large and small base, or between the different factions, etc., that kind of thing. Balance is basically the key thing that we as gamers look for. And the great thing about X-Wing is it has a very easy way of balancing the game. That little number in the bottom right-hand corner of the card, the squad points. There is nothing so overpowered you can't just curtail it by giving it a high squad point. Nothing so underpowered and irrelevant that you can't make relevant by making it cheap enough. It's really that straightforward. In the end, balance is what drives these FAQs. It's what drives these erratas. It leads to these erratas needing to come into effect, like for the Jump Masters, for example. It's now had 3 nerfs, although I contest it's only really been 1 nerf. It's the key thing that we question first and foremost. It's about what we as players want in the game. We want everything to be open and balanced as possible, because if everything's as balanced as possible, then the meta is wide open and we can play more different things. And being able to play different things and being creative is what we like about the game. The second element I want to talk about is fluff. And this is something that we probably don't think about. Fluff basically is compliance to the intellectual property that the game is trying to talk about. Obviously, X-Wing, we're talking about Star Wars starfighters. That is the fluff. And if things aren't compliant to that, if the ships in the game don't function the way the ships on the screen or in the books or anything from the Star Wars universe functions, frankly, it may as well not be a Star Wars game. It may as well be any other game, because if it's not fluff compliant, then there's no connectivity with that. Thankfully, X-Wing, I feel overall, is something that does that quite well. But in terms of the last FAQ, there was one thing which pushed away from the fluff, one thing that compromised on fluff, and that was the fix with the Jump Master. And one of you actually pointed this out, Mr. John Moody, and I'm so grateful you said this, because, as I said before, we tend to focus so much on balance that we sometimes forget that by forcing the game to be balanced, we actually do compromise on other things, such as fluff. And you pointed out correctly that Dengar's ship should have an astromech slot. That makes perfect sense. And I guess looking at this nerf, looking at this compromise on fluff, it ultimately boiled down to the Jump Master just needing a good solid nerf, and FFG just sort of pulling the trigger and saying, okay, for once we actually have to compromise on fluff. And this is something I'm pretty sure they don't want to do. They want to try and avoid in the future ever doing this again, because as I said, fluff is important. Fluff gives us a connection to the IP that X-Wing is trying to represent. Now, for those of you that are more interested in fluff, I recommend you give a listen to the Hell of a Pilot podcast. It's a group of local Melbourne X-Wing players. I've actually been on the podcast a couple of times, but the reason I bring these guys up is because on their podcast, they actually talk about the Star Wars lore, and they actually talk about things that relate directly to the game of X-Wing. In the last episode, they talked about Cass Scarlet, because somebody asked them, Who is this Cass Scarlet person? How does it relate to the game of X-Wing? And they talk about it. I tend to focus more on card function and ship function and that kind of stuff in my videos. I'm more of a strategist, but if you want to know about the fluff, listen to these guys. They've really got this stuff down pat. In fact, in the last podcast I was involved with, I asked them, hey, why does the assault gunboat have the slam action? Isn't that something that was only associated with the K-Wings? And they actually were really cool and looked up that information and revealed that in the last podcast. And yes, the Imperial designers of the assault gunboat did experiment with slam with the gunboat and several other similar ships. So you got to remember, you can't just slap, say, slam onto the assault gunboat and go, look, the ship's balanced. Perfect. I mean, it's good, it's spicy, it's interesting, I get that. But if the slam doesn't fit fluff-wise onto that ship, then it's a compromise on the fluff and it moves away what the source material is trying to tell us. Now, the third thing here, I want to have a chat about this because this, to me, is probably the biggest issue with X-Wing. I actually think that FFG overall are doing a very good job to address balance. I think they've done a very good job of adhering to fluff over the several years this game has been played. But the one thing that I think is most threatening the game right now is the growing issue of complexity. Complexity is a very broad term, but the way I think of it, complexity is a barrier standing in the way of immersion, understanding, enjoyment, and potentially even a new player entering the game. X-Wing is excellent for many reasons, one of which is it has relatively low complexity, in that a new player can look at it, understand it pretty quickly and get into it, which is an excellent thing about it. In fact, if you go onto FFG's YouTube channel, they have a roughly 7-minute video teaching you the basics of X-Wing. I don't know about you guys, but I actually got into the game because I watched that video and then I immediately played a demo game with another person that just watched that video. And just by watching that, we had enough understanding to get into it. And what that says is X-Wing is a fantastically simple game at its core, which means it's very accessible, and that's actually a really good thing. Simplicity is almost never a bad thing. Obviously, if a game's too simple, there's not enough substance. But the beauty about X-Wing is it's simple at the core, but complex if you want to dive down into the more complicated rules, ships, upgrades, etc. Now, in my eyes, complexity is a super important thing to understand, because as established players, we see this as less of an issue. Because as new ships get added to the game, as erratas get added to the game, we just increase our understanding by a little bit more. Cool, Genius used to do this thing that he could drop bombs before or after you move. Cool, now he's just that with a couple of caveats. That's fine. Anyone like me, and I'm guessing a lot of you guys that watch this channel, can understand that. But if you factor in the fact that, okay, somebody coming into the game sees that, that's just on top of everything else they've got to understand. They have to understand naught to up to this point, every game element as they enter it. So as we add more waves, we have more erratas, that's a growing issue. And particularly this last FAQ is, I believe, at least equal to the largest amount of erratas they've ever put in the game, and that is a growing issue. As I said, not so much an issue for me or most of you guys, but as a new player, you basically want what your cards say to match what they do in the game. That's pretty fundamental. And I think at the end of the day, we have to appreciate, yes, a lot of these changes, and me and a lot of the other more experienced players accept, yes, the change in the FAQ are good for the game. It helps it grow. It helps the meta be more broad. But the complexity that adds, to me, is a bit worrying. You make a game more and more complex, and eventually it just becomes inaccessible. Now, I don't think X-Wing is up to that point just yet. I think X-Wing has got a long way to go before it becomes so complex that it's completely inaccessible. As I said before, the fact that it is at its core a very simple game is actually a fantastic thing for it. It helps it stay healthy. It helps buy a bit more time before complexity gets completely out of hand. But I think definitely there are things FFG could be doing to curtail complexity. And very soon I'm going to be making a video on that because I think that's very, very important. And just an example of something they've done recently in this new FAQ that is an example of sort of favouring balance over complexity is the errata on Genius. And for those of you who watched that video I made talking specifically about Genius, You might have got the impression that I'm really down on what the card does. I'm actually not. The balance of this card is fine. It's a zero cost card that had an amazing combo. Putting a few caveats on it is fine. That makes perfect sense. What I don't like about what this new version of the card does is it adds a lot of complexity. It doesn't read that well. It's not sticky. Actually, while I'm here, I'm going to explain that term because I've used that term several times. Sticky means you read something, it clicks, it sticks, and you know what it means. You don't have to double take, you don't have to reread things. It makes sense, it's compliant, fluff-wise. You can just read the card, understand, and play with it. The problem is, Genius used to be sticky. Genius is not sticky anymore. You have to reread that card several times, think about it, and then you kind of get it. And that's not ideal. Obviously, having one or two cards that are not relatively sticky is not such a bad thing. You can reread these during a game, you can re-clarify things, but imagine if every single upgrade you had on the battlefield was not sticky. Imagine if you had to reread every pilot card every time an ability interacts with another. That's not a good thing. That kind of grates against this naturally uncomplicated nature of X-Wing. And it's something I want to talk about in more depth, and it's something I will talk about more. And I just feel like it's something that we as players should be concerned about. And if you guys take nothing else out of this video, just take away this fact. We should, as players, be demanding a very good, simple game that's non-complex and accessible for new players. Keep that at the heart of X-Wing, and it will be healthy and it will continue to grow and move forward. And if anyone from FFG happened to be watching this, I'm going to keep saying this over and over again. As I said at the start of the video, we've just hit 1,000 subscribers. If I can be a voice that actually gets through to the design team over at FFG, that'll make everything I do here on the channel worth it. These are the key things that and I think it's also the key things of most of you guys consider as well to be very important. And the issue of growing complexity in the game of X-Wing is something to be concerned about and is something that should be addressed. And overall, guys, that's where I'm coming from. These are the key things that I look at when we get new ship details released, when we get erratas and that kind of thing. These are the key things we should be watching out for. And I hope by watching this video, you kind of understand where I'm coming from. I hope it broadens the way you look at new ships in X-Wing and FAQs and erratas and that all things. And once again, thank you guys for getting us to 1,000 subs. We actually have our first battle report recorded, and I'll have that out over the next few days. But for the time being, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, like our Facebook page, and I will catch you later.